Good morning. Well, we are continuing with our journey as we walk with Jesus through the Gospel of Mark. We have come today to chapter 7 in the book of Mark, and specifically we are looking at what was happening in verses 1 through 13. Here's the situation. If you remember, when we last talked, Jesus had landed on the northern shore of the Sea of Galilee, and there he was healing many people, and lots of people were being drawn to him. Well, this passage tells us that some Pharisees and some of the scribes had come from Jerusalem. Isn't that interesting? They had come all that way from Jerusalem up to the northern shore of Galilee for the purpose of confronting Jesus. You got to ask, were they afraid of him? I think really they probably were, because he was gaining so much attention. So many people were being drawn to him. Some might optimistically add or ask, were they really wanting to understand him? I think not. I think we can see evidence here and in other places that what they were really trying to do was find a way to discredit Jesus. So they started questioning Jesus about the way that his disciples were not following their traditions. Specifically, in this case, Pharisees were asking about, why do your disciples not wash in this ceremonial way that had been prescribed by their tradition? And Jesus was pointing out to them that it was truly a tradition that they were following. But Jesus was a lot harder than a simple, easy reply. He confronted them directly with Scripture. Those Pharisees would certainly have been familiar with the book of Isaiah. And so Jesus quoted to them from Isaiah. This is in chapter 7, verses 6 through 8. And he said to them, that is, Jesus said to the Pharisees, rightly did Isaiah prophesy of you hypocrites, as it is written, this people honors me with their lips, but their heart is far away from me. But in vain do they worship me, teaching as doctrines the precepts of men. And then Jesus said, neglecting the commandment of God, you hold to the traditions of men. He went on to point out to them that they, the Pharisees, had figured out a way to even bypass a specific commandment in the law for their own conscience sake. They had figured out a way to identify whatever they might have given to their parents, their aging parents, in order to help them. They had figured out that they could identify those things as korban, that is given to God, and therefore they didn't have to pay attention to their needs of their parents. And they probably walked away from that feeling very self-righteous. Well, the truth is, all they were doing was bypassing a specific commandment of the law. So I'm sure they did not take that well, because they were being confronted with their own shortcomings, as Jesus was so good at doing. We see other places in Scripture where we are warned about following traditions rather than following the will of God. Over in the book of Colossians, chapter 2 and verse 8, it says this, see to it that no one takes you captive through philosophy and empty deception, according to the tradition of men, according to the elementary principles of the world, rather than according to Christ. Okay? Be guided by what Christ has given us, not by the traditions of men. The traditions of men change from time to time and from place to place, but the Scripture holds firm for all time. It was once for all given to us to be our guide. Tradition actually is talked about in other places in the scripture in a much more positive way, but in those places, I think the word tradition might better be understood as instruction. Paul admonished the early church to follow the traditions. He was not telling them to follow the traditions of men, but to follow the instruction that they had received from the apostles themselves. The negative side of tradition in a religious sense comes about when people are more inclined to follow a man-made practice that goes beyond what the scripture actually prescribes. So, as Jesus was walking throughout Palestine, he was continuously being confronted by those religious leaders, the scribes and the Pharisees, that he was being told that he was replying to them that they should follow the law rather than the traditions. But these people were confronting him, and they were troubled that he was not following the traditions. Truth is, those people were as inclined to follow the traditions as they were the law itself. The Pharisees, those self-righteous individuals, they saw themselves as the keepers of their Jewish traditions as well as the keepers of the law. We know, looking at a great big picture now, we know that originally there was the Torah. Actually, it's pronounced Torah. The first 5 books of the Old Testament, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, those were the books of law. And that set down this covenant law that was between God and the Jewish people. But as time went on, the Jewish leaders had taken that law and had gone further than the law actually prescribed and had developed the Talmud and the Mishnah, which is simply a written recording of the oral traditions and of other traditions that had developed along time. And the Pharisees were telling the people that they also had to follow the traditions. An example of this, by the way, just a simple example, is the idea of a Sabbath day's journey. Sabbath day's journey is a phrase that is used even in the New Testament, referring back to the law and what the people were doing. And it was generally understood to be 2,000 cubits. Well, did the law ever say that a person could not travel more than 2,000 cubits on the Sabbath? Nope, it never did. In the book of Exodus, and by the way, 2,000 cubits is roughly 3/5 of a mile. Okay, in the book of Exodus, there is a limit put on people's travel on the Sabbath, but it doesn't give a specific distance. And then over in Deuteronomy, there is a measure that is given of 2,000 cubits out from the city walls, and in that space is to be an area of agriculture. Well, the rabbis came along then and interpreted a Sabbath day's journey as being 2,000 cubits, even though Scripture never prescribed that number. So here's what might happen. What if Jesus walked 2,500 or 3,000 cubits on the Sabbath day? Was he violating the law? No, indeed he was not, because the law did not give a number. But was he violating their tradition? Indeed he was. And it was because of things like this that Jesus came under fire from those people who thought that he was obligated to follow their traditions. We look at that today. We criticize those people and say that we don't do that anymore. We don't follow traditions. We follow only the Scripture. And to that, I want to say, really? Now let me address just for a moment those of you who are listening to this who are members of the Church of Christ. Now I want you all to hear this, but I want to specifically address those who are members of the Church of Christ. We claim that we follow just Scripture, and indeed I think we do pretty well in a lot of areas. There are a lot of things that we do simply because we find those prescribed in Scripture, and in many cases we're doing things that may not be generally practiced, but we have good scriptural basis for that. The reason that we partake of the Lord's Supper on the first day of every week, we get that from a pattern set forth in Scripture. Even the thing that unfortunately we are most known for, and unfortunate because there are much bigger issues here, but the fact that we sing without the use of musical instruments. Some believe that that is just a tradition of ours, but it is not. It is in fact something that we draw from a pattern that is revealed in Scripture, and then we see a further development of that in the early church. That is not a Church of Christ tradition. We draw that from Scripture, and there's lots of things that are like that. Through centuries of examining Scripture, people have been drawn back to doing those original things. We call it restoration, restoring that original pattern. So, what about we in the churches of Christ? Are we tradition proof? Absolutely not. What about, let me just give you some examples. I get up to preach a sermon. I get to the end of that sermon. What if I don't offer what we call an invitation? That is a traditional thing. What if I don't offer it? Am I violating Scripture? Absolutely not. That is a tradition of men. Now, is it okay to offer an invitation? Yes, but it is not okay for any of us to ever say that is a necessity. What about even meeting in a church building, or having pews, or having song leaders? And we could go on. There are a number of things that we do that we follow traditions. There's nothing wrong in these things, but there is something wrong if we say that those are unbendable rules. What about, here's one that's kind of old, and it may not apply as much today as it used to, but what if men don't wear ties? A generation back, it used to be that if you were a man going to worship service, you wore a tie. Well, that has fortunately started going away. But I find it very interesting that preachers are still expected to wear a tie most often. If I get up to preach, I'm not wearing a tie. There are still people in my congregation that will gently point out to me, you know, it would have been nice if you were wearing a tie today. I actually have more people than that saying, I'm so proud of you for not wearing a tie, because we know that's a tradition. But all of this is just to say, if we say that we don't have traditions, we're fooling only ourselves. Scripture is truly our only guide. Otherwise, we become Pharisees protecting human tradition. Now, let me finish with one more idea, and that is that unity is important. So much emphasis is placed on unity. Jesus prayed for the unity of those who would follow him, even as he was in the garden on the night that he was betrayed. In the opening chapter of the book of 1 Corinthians, it says, let there be no divisions among you. And unity is emphasized all the way through Scripture. If we are truly to be what God designed us to be as his holy people, we are to be unified. And that unity is only going to come about if we respect Scripture as our only steadfast authority, and we don't get into following the traditions of people. If I hold my traditions to be necessary for you to follow, I'm adding to Scripture, and I don't have the right to do that. Now, I'll also say here that there are some circumstances we might get into that we might need to go along with the traditions of the people with whom we are meeting. Paul himself said, to the Jews I became as a Jew so that I might win the Jews. To those who are under the law, as under the law, though not myself being under the law, so that I might win those who are under the law. There are some traditions that we should recognize and respect, not to hold them steadfast as necessary, but just to not cause division. If I would happen to go to a congregation where they expected me to wear a tie, then I'm going to wear a tie. It's not that big a deal. But let me also say this. What if I was in Jerusalem, or perhaps in a congregation in New York City that was heavily populated by people who had been Jews, and maybe those men still felt obligated to wear a yarmulke as they would worship? Well, in those occasions, I'm going to wear a yarmulke because I don't want my steadfastness to divide people. We want to respect Scripture as Scripture, but I don't want to be unnecessarily offensive to others. And so we need to just be considerate about these things, and we need to recognize what are traditions of men and what is truly Scripture. I'll just close with this. I find the idea of wearing a yarmulke kind of an appropriate, nice thing. Because after all, if I wore a yarmulke, it'd cover up a good portion of my little bald spot back up here. Wouldn't I be cute? I hope you have a great day. Bye.
They resound with God's own heart. Oh, let the ancient words impart. Words of life, words of hope.